I'm really, really pleased that we're being joined by Trita Parsi. Trita is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is the author of three really remarkable books. And if you read these books, you can really trace the whole last couple decades of the relationship between the U.S. and Iran and Israel. Treacherous alliance, losing an enemy, a single roll of the dice. Trita has been probably the single most important person for me in helping me try to have some understanding of Iran and its relationship with the United States and with Israel. He's someone I really admire, partly just because of the depth of his analysis and the amount of information he brings to these conversations, but also because I think he's someone who has had to endure a lot within his own community because of his principles of peace, of non-militarism, of human rights. And I know it's not been easy for him. And so anyway, he's someone I really admire a lot. And Trita, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. And the admiration is very much mutual.
So I'm going to ask a really open-ended question and then let you just riff wherever you want because you know so much about this. And then we'll get into more specific things. To put it undiplomatically, what the fuck is going on right now? Where the fuck are we, basically, in this cataclysmic, criminal, horrifying situation?
It's a good way of putting it.
They don't put it like that on CNN, I know.
Yeah, no. Look, we are all involuntarily living in Trump's reality TV show these days. And these type of ridiculously just stunning turns of events are becoming somewhat normal. What I think really happened here, and some of this is based on conversations I've had with folks in government, the White House was in a clear panic Tuesday morning. There was a realization that there was a very significant likelihood that there would be an escalation. The Iranians would be striking at infrastructure of the GCC countries' oil and gas infrastructure.
These are the countries in the Persian Gulf, right?
In the Persian Gulf. Let me just clarify what the difference of this is. What we have right now was oil prices going up to 120, which is the paper price. The actual price was probably closer to 150. Part of the reason why the paper price never went all the way up to 150 is because there's tons of oil stuck on tankers in the Persian Gulf. So as soon as the strait opens up, that oil would be flowing into the markets and pushing down prices. So a lot of folks in the market were not willing to pay that high of a price for oil, knowing that it would come down very fast at some point. And I think they were over optimistic of how fast that would happen. Secondly, because of these oral interventions by Trump constantly claiming that a deal is in the making, blah, 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 he was deliberately manipulating the market. And for some reason, the market kept on buying it and has kept on buying it for years. Sorry, something happened to my chair. 1 second. Now, all of that combined nevertheless means that there was a crisis in the oil market, but it was not a production crisis. It's a crisis of a bottleneck. If things were to escalate and the US were to go after oil installations, or more likely the Israelis going after the power grids and things of that nature, that would then lead to a scenario in which we not only would have an oil crisis as a result of a bottleneck, but because of an actual production problem. And the reason why that makes matters so much worse is not just that oil prices would go up dramatically if you have a production problem, but because oil prices would stay up because of that production problem. I mean, the oil prices right now can come down relatively quickly if the strait opens fully, whereas if you have a production problem, it's not just whether the strait is open, they have to rebuild things. After the Israelis struck Parsi gas field, which is 1/3 Iranian, 2/3 Qatari, the Iranians retaliated by striking the Qatari gas installation. It's going to take the Qataris 3 to 5 years to rebuild them. Imagine if you had the same problem with the oil installations in the GCC, that it would take years for those to be rebuilt. That would create a massive problem. I mean, we're talking about a global depression. And it's in that moment of panic that you have Trump, issue these genocidal threats, etc. And but at the same time, there is I don't know if it's really fair to call it diplomacy, but there's an exchange of messages taking place. It's not just the Pakistanis. There's actually many other countries who were involved. Some of them did not want to have their name on it, not because they're ashamed of what they're doing, but because of already a tremendous amount of heat that they have taken for playing diplomatic roles. Um, and towards the end, what happens is that the Iranians insisted on their 10 points. There's different variations of those 10 points that are out there, but the bottom line is it is not America's 15 or Trump's 15 points that were accepted. Trump's 15 points essentially were the terms of Iran's capitulation. The 10 points are at times very maximalist. I mean, they're demanding that the US completely abandon all of its military installations and leave the region militarily. That's not going to happen. I don't think they actually included reparations in the 10 points. But bottom line is the Iranians would continue to control the straits. They would charge fees for ships that would transit, and they would decide who's coming in and who's coming out. The fact that Trump accepted that is a massive, massive gift to the Iranians. And moreover, there would be a complete ceasefire that would be encompassing not just US and Iran, but it would also encompass Israel and Iran's allies, proxies, whatever you want to call them, Hezbollah, the various Iraqi militias, and the Houthis. And then, of course, after this was done, first of all, Trump announced it before it was done. And I think it also reflects how eager and desperate he was to get this kind of a deal. And once it was done, and it appears also that the Chinese weighed in with the Iranians at the end to kind of push them in that direction, even though it's on their terms, more or less, I think we should recognize the Iranians were actually very reluctant to agree to it, and they had to deal with some problems internally after having agreed to it. And that is because, and they may be completely overplaying their hands, but they're essentially feeling that they were in a very, very good position. They could take a lot of these hits, and the United States was in a very dire position in terms of how this would not militarily impact the US, obviously, but rather because this was on the verge of destroying all of Trump's presidency. Because once you go down the path of that very high level and long-term oil prices, that would most likely lead to Trump losing his own base. And if you follow the polls of his base, because they're watching Fox News, they're in a completely different universe, have no idea what actually is happening. And the support actually has remained above 60%. It was much higher in the beginning, but it was still high enough that Trump kind of felt comfortable. But that would be lost. And it would be particularly lost if Trump, as part of this escalation, would also go in with ground troops, because then you would have a high level of American deaths. By the way, I don't know if this is true or not, but I do want to throw out, because I had people from the US government kind of hint that there's at least some elements of truth in it. That whole story with the pilot being rescued is not entirely clear how true it was. It may very well be that a pilot was rescued, and it may very well be that it was a success. But it appears to have been part of a larger failed military operation that targeted Iran's nuclear sites, because the geography doesn't make sense. He was shot down in Khuzestan, but then he's found close to Esfahan, where some of the nuclear facilities are. That's where some of the big planes were shot down. There's a lot of it that is murky. Again, I don't know which story is true. The Iranians are completely convinced that this was the beginning of a military operation to try to take some of the HEU, 60%, or other parts of
the highly enriched
uranium, and it failed. And the U.S. actually lost more airplanes in those 24 hours than it has lost since Vietnam, apparently. And this further has added to this confidence that the Iranians have right now, which made it a little bit tricky for them to agree to this. But that's why I think that the Chinese intervention may actually have been true. Because if the Chinese kind of come down and say, you got to do this, we're not going to support you, the Chinese have definite leverage over the Iranians. So now we end up in this situation. The Speaker of the Parliament, who's essentially emerged as the de facto president of Iran, as so many different people have been killed, and the current president has lost a tremendous amount of credibility and support within the system. Ghalibaf just tweeted that the talks won't even take place unless some of the conditions that were agreed upon are delivered upon. And one of them was not in the 10 points, but it was that there would be a release of Iran's frozen assets. What I suspect they're referring to is the frozen, the Iranians have roughly $120 billion in foreign banks that the US have frozen as part of Trump leaving the JCPOA and reimposing sanctions. There was an agreement between the Biden administration and the Iranians in August or September 2022 as part of the release of some Americans who were imprisoned in Iran wrongfully, and some other things. The Iranians would get $7 billion that was in a South Korean bank transferred to Qatar. The Qataris would hold it, but the Qataris would, in coordination with OFAC, allow the Iranians to buy food and medicine using that money. The money would never go back to Iran. It would sit in Qatar, but the Iranians would be able to use the money to buy food and medicine. And as you remember, that was still at a point where COVID was not entirely over. 3 weeks or so after that agreement was reached, you have the Mahsa Amini protest in Iran, massive protest against the way that this young woman was killed in police custody for not wearing her hijab properly. And the Biden administration quietly backtracked on the agreement. They had already managed to get the Americans released, but they never released the money or allowed the money to be used. So I suspect if it is true what the Speaker of the Parliament is saying, it's probably that money, maybe even more. And if that is true, then it also says that Trump agreed to more than just what was in those 10 points, additional points. All of this means that we may not even see diplomacy taking place in Islamabad in the next couple of days.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.